Tell us a little bit about the results of your study. What did you learn after the study with the blocks and the children?
There's been a series of studies looking at the role of explanation on learning in early childhood. And it's been known for a long time that explanation, just prompting children to answer why questions during learning, seems to support and improve learning subsequently, which at first is a little bit puzzling, right? Because they're not necessarily getting any new information from the world. You're not giving them any new information. You're just asking them to elaborate on something that they've already observed. And just that process seems to support learning. So the study was really aimed at trying to find out exactly what mechanism is involved in facilitating those learning benefits for kids. And essentially what we found is that when children are making observations in the world, when you prompt them to answer why questions, they're going to be looking for the sort of broad regularities or broad patterns that they observe and focus in on those and attend to them so that later on they'll be using those broad regularities and patterns in making future inferences.
Give us an example.
In the study, right, we were sort of giving kids a series of, they were shown a new kind of causal system, so something they had never observed before, which was a toy that would activate and play music when some things were placed on top and was inert otherwise. And so their job was to try to figure out what is the causal rule here? What is the mechanism by which this new toy works? And there were a couple of features that were attached to the blocks that were sort of hints for what might be the thing that was causally active. And there were two different patterns. One of them accounted for all of the data that they observed. So 100% of the times that the toy played music, the block that was placed on top had a little Lego of a particular color attached. But there was another rule too that was pretty good, right? There was a rule that accounted for about 75% of the data that they observed. So that most of the time, but not all of the time, when they saw this relationship, that sort of separately colored Lego was also on the toy. So what we find is that with young kids, they tend to sort of lump these things together. They're not really attending to which cause is sort of more effective. They sort of treat them both as causal. And so in the study, what we find is that by simply prompting them to answer why as they sort of are going through the course of learning leads them to prioritize and sort of privilege the cause that accounts for a greater proportion of the data that they see. And you can also think of this as sort of noticing anomalies, right? Noticing data that doesn't quite fit within a particular theory that they hold about the world, which is incredibly important, for example, when you're doing any kind of scientific reasoning, right? So when you're learning about science, a lot of the time you have more than one possible hypothesis that could be true. And sometimes one hypothesis is a little bit better because the alternative has anomalous data or data that doesn't quite fit, right, with the thing that you're trying to find out. And so the idea here, this sort of real world example, is that in order to learn anything in a scientific domain, you have to be really attentive to the hypotheses that are going to be supporting you, right, supporting your inquiry, and sort of notice when there are sort of anomalous observations as well. And so it seems like prompting children to explain during the learning process might support these kinds of things.
So what's the takeaway here then for parents and for teachers?
What's nice about this is that it basically provides an incredibly simple prompt, right? Instructional prompt that anybody can use, right? Teachers and parents and caregivers. So by simply asking why pretty frequently during a learning process, that can be when your kid is sort of exploring a novel toy, it can be in the science museum, it can be in the classroom when they're trying to learn about how to do science experiments, or even when you're reading a book, you can sort of ask these simple questions, get your kid to engage and generate an answer, and it will lead them to notice these more abstract kinds of patterns and regularities that might be present in their environment.
Is this something that was going to help them? Were they all 4 and 5 years old?
In the study that you guys filmed, they were 5-year-olds, 4 and 5-year-olds. But there's a variety of studies out there now that show that kids even as young as 3 seem to be influenced by these simple why prompts. So we have 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, and then there's a lot of research with school-age children. So this has been something that's been studied for quite a while in elementary school and middle school classrooms. Sort of incorporating explanation prompts into learning curriculum winds up leading to better outcomes for learning.
And then your experiment, actually what you did was go younger, if it already exists for elementary school kids.
That's right. So we were exploring whether we could extend these findings to even preschool-age children. You know, there's some question about whether they'd be any good at it or whether it would have the same effects because as you might have seen, young children have trouble kind of verbalizing an explanation about something that they observe. And so what we find is that sort of regardless of the explanations that they actually generate, just that process of engaging with the explanation, trying to come up with one, seems to be the thing that's doing the bulk of the work.
Because they're younger and super, super impressionable, do you have any hypothesis of whether this makes them better learners when they're in high school or college?
We haven't looked at longitudinal studies, which would follow an individual kid over time, and we can't say much about whether or not these things have long-term outcomes. What we do know is that, learning, certainly, so when you're sort of engaged in an instance of learning, it can influence the things that you attend to and therefore the things that you take away from that learning experience. So obviously those things are going to have an impact later on.
And maybe they're learning a pattern of asking why. I always do better when I know why something's going to work.
I suppose we could be instilling sort of learning strategies and sort of general reasoning skills, to think about broader abstraction. And actually, that's a good point. So younger children tend to focus on the sort of super salient surface details in their environment. So if you read them a story, the things that they're most excited about thinking about are sort of the characters and the scene, and the actual events of the story. But a lot of the time when we read them stories, our goal as parents or caregivers, is to try to get them to learn something, some sort of overarching theme or pattern or abstract generalization that they can then apply, in their real life. And so by prompting them in these explanation contexts, we can get them to more easily sort of overlook, the sort of salient, superficial details of the story and really extract something that's more broad and generalizable to inform the future.
What haven't I asked about the study that you would like to get across?
I think one of the most important things about it is that, so we don't intend to say that why questions are sort of universally good. So it turns out that different kinds of questions that you ask children support learning in vastly different ways. And so there's these unique and selective benefits of asking why questions that you get, which are things like supporting noticing broad regularities, picking up on anomalous data, looking for abstract kinds of generalizations and patterns. But some of the time when you're learning, the thing that you want the kid to learn is precisely the opposite of that. So maybe you want them to learn the color of an object, or what something looks like in a particular context, or what the details of a particular situation are. Or maybe there is no pattern to learn, and you don't want them grasping for patterns that aren't really there, So I think that giving a prompt for an explanation can be really supportive in some contexts, but can actually harm learning in other contexts. And so the idea is that it's not a universal kind of catch-all for improving things. It's a very specific kind of prompt that you can sort of introduce in a variety of domains to get kids reasoning more broadly.
Tell me about your educational background. Where'd you go for undergrad, grad, PhD?
I went to undergraduate at Boston University. I double majored in psychology and philosophy. I was actually quite disillusioned with the field of psychology, which is where I find myself now. I decided I was going to leave the field, and I got a master's degree in philosophy of science. And I found myself in the context of that degree really exploring mostly cognitive questions. And so I started a PhD program. My master's degree in philosophy was at University of Chicago. And then I started a PhD program actually at Boston College originally, doing developmental psychology, studying the mind, studying ideas about where knowledge comes from. But the lab wasn't the best fit for me, so I dropped out of my PhD program. I got a second master's degree in psychology, and I reapplied, and I started over at UC Berkeley in the psychology department there. It was an excellent fit for me, and I did complete my PhD there, and then got this job here.
Where was your second master's?
The second master's was at Boston College.
Based on this study, what do you think needs to be looked at next?
There's a ton to be looked at next. So now we've established, that young kids are sensitive to these why prompts. And we've also established that they're unique and selective, which means that they don't sort of support learning across cases. So we're taking this work in a couple of different directions. One direction is sort of exploring other kinds of questions that you could ask that are similar kinds of questions, but do radically different things. So for example, we're starting a couple of studies that look at what happens if you ask why, and then you ask why again. So essentially asking them to generate not just one sort of sweeping or broad generalizable explanation, but forcing them to then find other alternative hypotheses. And what we think is that just asking something more than once might wind up leading kids to a very different kind of learning where they're sort of exploring alternatives. So that's kind of one direction that we've been taking it in.
Who funded this research?
A variety of different things along the way, right? So I conducted a lot of the research that you guys covered today while I was at UC Berkeley. So that was funded by the National Science Foundation at some point, Templeton Foundation at some point. And I got sort of a graduate grant called the Elizabeth Coppets Child Development Fellowship that was funded by the APA during that time. So at least 3, but probably more.
Has your study been published yet, and if so, where?
Yeah, so the study that you guys filmed is in Child Development. So it's been published for about a year or 2 now. And it's actually a series of studies along with a computational model for what might be going on during learning. But there's a variety of other papers that have also looked at explanation of learning that have been published that I've referenced here. So some are in the journal Cognition.
What would you like policymakers to know about the work you and your colleagues are doing?
I feel like these sorts of prompts can be very, very easily sort of sent out, right, to sort of notifying parents and caregivers that these things exist and that these things have really powerful impacts on learning. And so I think that this is one of those really simple ways, right, that you can easily incorporate some of the research that's coming out in child development, sort of connecting it with educational policy that's influencing how classrooms are taught. These things also have implications for, so online learning environments are sort of growing in popularity. And this is the kind of thing that works really well with that, right? So you can sort of introduce various strategically placed prompts in the context of online educational formats and get these really nice results. I think there's a lot of questions still to be asked about how these prompts interact with pedagogy, right? So this idea of like, typically we ask a kid for an explanation, we're serving the role as the pedagogue, right? The teacher. And so there's a lot of work out there that shows that kids make particular inferences depending on where a question is coming from. So there's a lot of work to do to sort of look at how these prompts can be included in different kinds of contexts, both formal learning contexts and informal ones, to see where it goes.
How do you measure success of these kids if they've learned these kinds of strategies with the why questions?
Yeah, so measuring success is going to be different with every domain, right? So it really depends on what the learning goals are. In certain contexts, like in scientific reasoning contexts, perhaps a measure of success would be the kid being able to identify the hypothesis that's best fit, right, to the observations that they make. In the context of reading comprehension and narrative comprehension, which we've also shown, right, effects of explanation on, it might be being able to extract the theme of the story and the moral of the story and then generalize that theme to some novel context that looks quite different. So those are really different kinds of outcomes, but I think in general, what we're looking for why questions in particular is the kid's ability to look for these broad sweeping regularities and abstractions.